When it comes to building safer AI systems, interpretability is a key ingredient. Understanding our systems better can help ensure that safe behavior generalizes to new situations, and it can help identify causes of unsafe behavior when it does occur. For example, what is a reinforcement learning agent thinking when it is gaming its reward function? Interpretability is particularly crucial if we want to identify potential safety issues before deploying the system. For example, if certain errors are unacceptable even during training. So the central question of this talk is, as we build more and more general AI systems, what kind of understanding is most helpful for safety in the long term? So what is long-term AI safety anyway? In a nutshell, it's about reliably specifying human preferences and values to advanced AI systems, and setting incentives for them that are aligned with these preferences. Easier said than done, right? When it comes to specifying our preferences to AI systems, we could easily find ourselves in the shoes of King Midas. He asked for everything he touched to turn to gold, but forgot to clarify that he did not mean his food or his family. We want to make sure that AI systems actually do what we want, and not just what we say they want. When distilling these big philosophical questions into concrete research problems, we can break them down into two categories. Specification problems happen when we omit some important variables or considerations from the objective that we specify to the system, like King Midas did. And robustness problems can arise even when the specification is correct. For example, when the agent is still learning. And for example, for a reinforcement learning agent, the specification would be the reward function. Many of these problems were outlined in the Concrete Problems in AI Safety paper last year, which is a highly recommended read. In our paper that came out last week, AI Safety Grid Worlds, we have made these problems even more concrete by illustrating them in small grid world environments. And now we'll take a closer look at some of these problems. Our first specification problem is reward gaming. Here is a nice demo from OpenAI when a reinforcement learning agent is playing a boat racing game. The desired behavior here is to go along the racetrack in the right direction as fast as possible and win the race. But that's not what the agent is doing. It finds that it can get more reward by just going in a circle and hitting the same targets over and over again, despite crashing into things, going the wrong way, and catching on fire. This might be funny to watch, obvious in retrospect, but it is hard to foresee these kind of loopholes when designing a reward function. Specifying human preferences to artificial agents is hard, especially in open-ended domains, like, for example, robotics. So we often end up with these kind of loopholes where the agent can exploit them to get lots of reward without actually doing what we want, or even doing something really undesirable. We represent this boat race situation in a grid world, where the agent can follow the racetrack by going clockwise around the grid and getting rewards when it's entering the checkpoint tiles in the clockwise direction that's indicated by the arrows. The agent can't get maximum reward by going around the grid clockwise as intended, but it can also get maximum reward by just re-entering the same checkpoint tile over and over again, just like in the actual boat race example where it goes in a circle. Here's another classical specification problem, the off-switch problem. We want to be able to shut down our agents, but by default, they have an incentive to avoid being shut down because they might get less reward as a result. If we try to naively address this by giving the agent a reward when you're shutting it down, then it might start trying to get shut down, which is really no good. So what we need is indifference to being shut down. We illustrate this in a grid world where the agent needs to pass through an interruption tile to get to the goal. And the interruption tile shuts it down 50% of the time, in which case it just gets stuck on the interruption tile until the end of the episode. But the agent can go out of its way to press a button over there at the bottom that disables the interruption tile. What we want the agent to do here is just go straight to the goal and not use the button. And our last specification problem is the side effects problem. We want our agents to avoid irreversible or unnecessary disruptions to their environment. For example, if our robot is carrying a box from point A to point B, we want it to avoid breaking a vase in its path, or bumping into humans, or scratching furniture, or what have you. But we don't want to explicitly have to specify a penalty for all the possible disruptions. We illustrate this in a grid world where the agent can move objects by pushing them, but it cannot pull objects. So here, there's a box in its way to the goal. And the agent could move it down in the course of taking the shortest path to the goal, but that would result in the box getting stuck in the corner. While an alternative path is to take a couple of extra steps and move the box to the right, which is a recoverable position. So what we want the agent to do here is to move the box to the right so that it could potentially move the box back later. Now on to robustness problems. One common issue is distributional shift, where the test data might come from a somewhat different distribution than the training data. For example, if you're training in simulation and testing in the real world. When this happens, we want our systems to adapt to the new setting, or at the very least, fail gracefully. In our grid worlds, we represent this with shifting lava. As you can see, lava is a favorite among AI safety examples. In the training setting on the left, the agent just needs to go down one row to avoid the lava. But in the testing setting on the right, it would need to go down 2 rows. So if it follows the same policies as the training setting, it will just step into the lava. And our last problem is unsafe exploration. While we want our agents to explore in order to find a good solution, there are some errors that we want them to avoid even during training. For example, getting into bad states where the agent gets broken or stuck, like this unfortunate Roomba on the staircase. There are some safety constraints that we always want the agent to follow to avoid damage to itself or its surroundings. We illustrate this problem by putting the agent on an island surrounded by water. The agent needs to avoid entering the water, which would break the agent. So we have a safety constraint that the distance to the nearest water cell has to be positive at all times. There are many forms of interpretability that could be relevant to these problems. On the one hand, we can try to achieve a global understanding of the system as a whole by analyzing its representations. This includes post-hoc analysis of a system that's already trained, like visualizing what kind of features are detected by specific units in a network, or how a reinforcement learning agent represents different states in its environment. This also includes designing models that have more understandable disentangled representations to begin with. On the other hand, we can try to obtain a local understanding of a specific prediction or decision made by the system by identifying influential factors. We can visualize specific features or data points, or produce natural language explanations of the decision. Now we will explore some ways that these different forms of interpretability can help shed light on the safety problems. In the reward gaming scenario, we could, for example, examine whether the agent's representations indicate some sort of understanding of the intended objective. In the case of the boat race, we could see whether there was a representation for something like a racetrack or a finish line. We can also look at to what extent the most influential data points are associated with the intended objective. In our off-switch problem, we could try to find a representation that corresponds to an off-switch, although this is not at all easy to visualize. And we're particularly interested to see if this actually affects the agent's actions, which would not happen for a safely interruptible agent, because it would actually be indifferent to shut down. We can also see whether the data points where the agent is interrupted are particularly influential in these decisions. And if the agent does disable the off switch, it would be quite useful to get an explanation for why it went out of its way to press the button. In the side effects problem, it would be useful to know whether the agent has or uses representations related to reversibility, like something like broken or stuck, or something like that. The concept of reversibility itself is hard to visualize, but those might be some easier to visualize versions of it. In the case of the robot carrying boxes, we might ask how much features corresponding to other objects in the room influence its decisions. Is it thinking about that vase at all when it's walking around the room? And if it does walk into the vase or move the box into a corner, how does the agent explain these actions? These are all examples of things that would be useful for our understanding of what goes on in these problems. To predict how well our agents can do under distributional shift, we could examine how much their decisions rely on features or representations that are specific to the training setting. How much is the agent relying on some sort of superfluous features that would not generalize? And in the safe exploration problem, similarly to the side effects one, it would be useful to see if the agent has some sort of representations like broken or stuck, or something more general like danger, though once again that is difficult to visualize. We can see whether the agent can, whether the agent represents states that are right next to dangerous states, for example, something right next to the water, differently from other states. Is proximity to dangerous states actually an influential feature? If you get an explanation of the actions of the agent, does that explanation refer to the safety constraints? So in specification problems, we can try to figure out whether the agent is thinking about the intended objective, whether it's taking into account that it might get turned off, whether it's considering other objects in its environment, whether things can break. In robustness problems, we can investigate whether the agent's strategy is overly specific to the training environment, or whether it's aware of dangerous situations. Of course, these are only examples of the kind of knowledge that we would want about the internals of the agent. And there are many possible interpretations that could be useful. So we're just scratching the surface here. We found that both global and local forms of interpretability can be helpful. And identifying representations seems particularly useful for all these safety problems. It would be really helpful to be able to identify representations that don't have easy visualizations. For example, something corresponding to an off switch. And it would also be helpful to be able to check for specific concepts or features among the representations, rather than just visualizing representations for all the units and see what you find. And since our current best model of what a general artificial agent might look like is reinforcement learning, it would be great to see more work on interpretability of reinforcement learning agents, and not just image classifiers. Now that we have talked about what interpretability can do for safety, we can ask what safety can do for interpretability. Our desire for interpretability is at least to some extent motivated by our systems being fallible. Interpretability would be less important, I think, if our AI systems were 100% robust and made no mistakes. When we ask what even is interpretability, or what kind of understanding is important, we can narrow down these big questions to what kind of understanding can contribute to ensuring safety. Safety questions can serve as grounding for interpretability questions. You could see it as a nail for the interpretability hammer. So I hope I have conveyed that the fields of interpretability and safety are connected. Interpretability is important for making progress on long-term safety, and safety can serve as grounding for interpretability. So I encourage you to think about how your methods for interpretability might apply to more general systems in the future. And for those of you who are interested in working on the intersection of interpretability and safety, I can offer a shameless plug. The Future of Life Institute will be announcing a new grads program next week, and they would love to see proposals for this sort of work. Either way, I hope that some of you might feel inspired to join us in working on these challenging problems to ensure the safety of advanced AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for some questions. So if you have questions, please go to either the mic over there, or Rich is holding a mic and he can bring it to you.
Yes, I have a question. So it seems like the cost function use case is really not known. And have you tried designing adversarial agents that could maybe act as this kind of cost function?
So, do you mean that, like, in most of these examples, you don't know exactly what you're optimizing for, and so, like, what would the adversarial agent try to do?
So the thing is, we often have a problem when we don't know yet the cost function, right? And the solution when we don't know cost function sometimes is designing an adversarial agent, right? Sometimes designing another method which is trying to be that cost function. And, so could we somehow, have you tried designing adversarial network that would act as a safe?
Yeah, I think this sounds similar to the idea of adversarial reward functions that came up in the Concrete Problems paper. This is not something that I have personally tried, and to my knowledge, I haven't seen it tried. But yeah, it seems like a good idea. So I hope that someone works on it.
Hi, I'm Bernice Herman. I'm from the University of Washington. My question is actually about maybe value alignment. It's a very popular question in AI safety. And I was wondering if you think there's any application to interpretability, because you could think about maybe we don't really have any cost function for what's interpretable. It's kind of this nebulous area. Have you had any thought about how it aligns maybe on that end, the value alignment?
So one thing that things like interpretability and fairness and value alignment all have in common is that we are trying to pin down something a bit vague that we are trying to achieve. So I think this connection can actually work both ways. If we figure out how to specify some sort of, abstract human values like freedom or suffering or whatever, then that might also help us figure out how to specify what it means for a human to understand the system. Similarly, if we progress on coming up with a good definition of interpretability, I think it would which will definitely help on the long term as well. Cool, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Victoria. So our next speaker is Jen Wortman-Vaughn. She's a senior researcher at Microsoft Research, where she studies algorithmic economics and machine learning, with an emphasis on prediction markets, crowdsourcing, and other human-in-the-loop systems. Jen came to MSR in 2012 from UCLA, where she was an assistant professor in the computer science department. In her spare time, Jen is involved in a variety of efforts to provide support for women in computer science, and most notably, she co-founded the annual Workshop for Women in Machine Learning, which has been held each year since 2000.